Bom dia a todos. Prazer receber vocês. Mais um encontro do Tiaços. Hoje é um dia especial, sábado de Aleluia. Então, de alguma maneira, acho importante também a gente marcar isso. Uma boa Páscoa para quem está aqui, um bom sábado de Aleluia. E curiosamente, tem uma certa ironia aqui, que a gente está hoje no meio da Páscoa e nós iremos falar de dois autores que têm uma relação muito específica com o cristianismo, Nietzsche e Jung. Para falar disso, a gente vai receber Gaia Domenici. Gaia, eu vou fazer sua apresentação formal primeiro. Gaia, ela obteve o seu PhD em filosofia pela Universidade de Pisa, na Itália, em 2015, defendendo uma tese intitulada Para Todos e Nenhum, Zarathustra, o Livro Vermelho e Obras Visionárias. Esse trabalho foi escrito sob a supervisão de Giuliano Campione e de Sonu Chandassani e Martin Liebscher. A Gaia se mudou para Londres em 2013 e atualmente ela é pesquisadora honorária no Instituto de Estudos Avançados da Universidade College de London. Ela também é editora-chefe da revista Funnies, jornal for Jungian History. Os interesses atuais de Gaia também dizem respeito à filosofia da boa forma e do fisiculturismo. Gaia ela é coach certificada em nutrição e saúde e personal trainer de nível 3, treinando para se tornar coach de força e condicionamento de nível 4. Isso faz parte de um projeto de pesquisa dela, que está acessível no seu site, que depois a gente vai colocar aqui. Gaia é autora desse fabuloso livro. Eu cheguei até a Gaia através de um amigo meu espanhol, que havia me indicado esse livro. É um livro excepcional, porque ela apresenta uma visão inteiramente diferente, até então, de uma possibilidade de interpretação junguiana sobre Nietzsche. E a tese da Gaia é de que é através do Livro Vermelho que nós vamos conseguir entender a relação do Jung com o homem Nietzsche. Só para a gente finalizar, nesse sentido, a Gaia ela entra numa linhagem dos grandes autores junguianos que têm se dedicado a pensar a relação Jung com Nietzsche, como Lucy Huskisson, que já esteve aqui no Tiaços conosco, e Paul Bishop, autor do clássico livro O Self Dionisíaco, que estará conosco também em setembro. Então, Gaia, seja bem-vinda, é um prazer te receber, espero que você se sinta à vontade, a palavra é sua. Obrigado.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Marcus, for having me. Thanks, Isa, for translating me. It's a real pleasure and an honor for me to be here today. Thank you all for showing up. I'm going to share my screen now because I prepared a quick presentation. So I was invited here today to talk about my book. And I realized that talking about my book is telling my own story on the one hand, and also talking about an unspoken dialogue, a dialogue which never took place on the other. The reason why such a dialogue never took place, other than historical, is because Jung and Nietzsche had two radically different perspectives on life that would make such a dialogue impossible. Yes, Nietzsche died when Jung was finishing medical school, and as reported by Paul Bishop, Jung was apparently invited to Nietzsche's funeral, although he most likely never showed up. However, Even if Nietzsche had still been alive, him and Jung would never really have understood each other, as we shall see later. Nonetheless, Nietzsche played an influential role in the evolving of Jung's psychology, not really as a philosopher, rather as a man, as has been already said. In particular, as a man who paid the consequences of a failed individuation. The reason why talking about my book is also telling my story is because this book developed over a 10-15-year-long journey, which can't be separated from the book itself. I became fascinated with Nietzsche's philosophy and thus spoke Zarathustra as an undergraduate student in 2005-2006. I was lucky enough to have Giuliano Campioni as my mentor and supervisor back in Pisa, where I studied. Giuliano Campioni is one of the most prominent scholars of Nietzsche, as well as the direct pupil of Giorgio Colli and Mazzino Montinari, who invented the historical critical method of approach to Nietzsche's philosophy. Such a method rejects systematic metaphysical interpretations of Nietzsche and favors a philological reading of his writings, contextualizing each of them with references, sources, letters, other relating published and unpublished material. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because this method has had a huge impact on my approach to Jung's writings too. I became extremely fascinated with psychological readings of Nietzsche and Zarathustra, so I decided to write my master thesis on Jung's seminar on Zarathustra, a 5-year-long seminar that Jung delivered in Zurich from 1934 to 1939. Sorry about that. To my great surprise, I found out that Jung had completely misunderstood Nietzsche from a philosophical perspective. However, I wasn't happy with my findings, as Jung seemed to me too smart a guy to have missed so many important details of Nietzsche, and there must be something behind his interpretation. Jung understood Nietzsche as an inflated man, as someone inflated with a wise old man archetype, completely incapable of connecting with the anima and recognizing the self, hence incapable of individuating. The philosophical significance of some important concepts, such as the Übermensch or the eternal return, was completely overlooked by Jung by virtue of a strong psychological interpretation. Around about the same time, the Red Book came out, and I found an abundance of implicit and explicit references to Nietzsche and Zarathustra in it. So I decided to do my PhD on Nietzsche in the Red Book. And for this research, I am eternally grateful to Sonu Shamdasani and Martin Lipscher, who have supervised me and who also share my historical critical approach, not only to Nietzsche, but also to Jung. And I would never be where I'm now if it hadn't been for them. So I'm really grateful for them. I went to Jung's library in Küsnacht to check the marginalia Jung annotated on Nietzsche's texts. And surprisingly enough, among the marginalia Jung wrote on his own copy of Nietzsche's Zarathustra, I found quite a few significant references to his own Red Book. This gave me the key to solve my mystery. Jung understood Zarathustra as if it was Nietzsche's Red Book. Interestingly, even though certain elements of Jung's interpretation of Nietzsche remain consistent over the years, Jung's overall consideration of Nietzsche in his published writings changes significantly after 1914. Beforehand, Nietzsche is regarded as a precursor of archetypal experiences. Afterwards, Nietzsche becomes the example of someone who has tried to deny the power of the unconscious and the independence of the divine. We know for a fact that Jung read Zarathustra for the second time in winter 1914-1915, And we also know for a fact that Nietzsche appears in a fantasy of Jung's from January 1914, now published as a chapter in the Red Book. The Red Book, then, marks an important transition in Jung's understanding of Nietzsche and Zarathustra that can't be denied. But what does this mean? How could Zarathustra and the Red Book be placed in a similar context? Well, the answer is given by what Jung defines in Psychology and Literature from 1930 as visionary works, which I dealt with in the first part of my book. As opposed to psychological works, whose contents derive from deliberate choices of their authors, visionary works appear to derive their contents directly from the unknown, from the unconscious. Nietzsche's Zarathustra is considered by Jung a visionary work in his 1930 definition, along with the second part of Goethe's Faust, Spitteler's Olympian Spring, Wagner's Parsifal and Ring, Dante's Commedia, and others. As Jung suggests, however, the list can go on, and indeed it is easy to find many more references to the same tradition in other writings by Jung, even prior to Psychology and Literature, in particular in Psychological Types from 1921, where great attention is also given to Spitteler's Prometheus and Epimetheus. Throughout his works, Jung expands the list to include, among others, Hölderlin's poem Song of Destiny from Hyperion and Fischer's Auchenheim. Goethe, Hölderlin, Fischer, and Spitteler are indeed often linked by Jung with Zarathustra, in particular during the seminar on Zarathustra, as we can see from a few quotes that I'm sharing here. So you can read them if you want. These are just a couple of examples. There are more in the text. So other than being all presumably written under the influence of the unconscious, however, such works share similar stylistic peculiarities. So, for example, there's an ample use of mythology and biblical references, the symbolical language, they all present prophetical tones, etc. And their authors, so these visionary authors, also share similar educational backgrounds and environments. In particular, strongly rooted in the so-called visionary works appears to be the presence of Friedrich Kreutzer and his high idea of mythology as the bearer of universal truths, which was very much present in Basel, to which all of these authors were one way or another connected, thanks to the presence of Jakob Burckhardt and Johann Jakob Backhofen. As you might know, just as a side note, Jung himself borrowed his archetypes definition from Burckhardt's Urbilder, the primordial images, to signify symbols which are universally occurring regardless of the epoch. How would the Red Book fit in this category? Well, first of all, the Red Book was the result of what Jung calls active imagination, which is precisely letting the unconscious come to surface while closely observing its images for further interpretation. Even more specifically, when the first visions arose in 1912-1913, Jung feared the onset of a psychosis. Moreover, in one occasion, Jung records anxiety after one of his experiment with active imagination. Secondly, the Red Book presents highly prophetical tones quite recurrently. Thirdly, not only the Red Book per se, but the therapeutic effect of active imagination are described by Jung in terms of mythology. So the Red Book was arguably Jung's visionary work. And interestingly, Jung too had much to do with Basel environment where he grew up and with its literary tradition too. In the second part of my book, I moved on to investigating the relation between Zarathustra and the Red Book more closely by looking at the implicit and explicit references to Nietzsche and Zarathustra in the Red Book. First of all, there are some generic stylistic similarities worth noting, as well as the fact that for his biblical citation, Jung decides to quote from Luther's Bible, just as Nietzsche does. Jung and Nietzsche do not quite belong to the same Protestant tradition, as Nietzsche was German and originally Lutheran, while Jung was Swiss and belonged to the Swiss Reformed Church. Nonetheless, the very fact that Jung chooses to use the same Bible used by Nietzsche suggests an intent to use Nietzsche's same language to debate and reject him. Then I took into account all those implicit and explicit references to Nietzsche and Zarathustra. The explicit references are quite obvious. During the asylum episode, Jung's eye comes across a madman who believes to be Nietzsche. Even prior to that scene, Nietzsche is the protagonist of a dialogue between Jung's eye and the librarian. The motive of the death of God recurs quite often in the Red Book. And Nietzsche is also implicitly, though quite clearly, mentioned or referred to in Scrutinies. All these references happen after 1914, and this is an important point to note, as we have already mentioned. As to the implicit references, these are all those occurrences of certain symbols, metaphors, and other images which are predominant not only in Nietzsche's philosophy, but in all visionary tradition too. However, the way Jung understands and manipulates these images derives from Nietzsche, and the use he makes of them is directed to Nietzsche. Indeed, when contextualized with other published writings of Jung's, as well as with other chapters from the Red Book, and with marginalia annotated next to Jung's copy of Zarathustra, such images reveal Jung's intention of addressing Nietzsche. I'm going to give an example. In the Red Book emerges a symbolic constellation formed by the images of the desert and the lion in relation to the idea of self-transformation. Even though at a first glance, this idea does not appear to be connected with Nietzsche's philosophy more than other visionary material, in which both the lion and the desert notably play a significant role, with a little bit of a contextualization, Nietzsche's presence emerges quite clearly. Nietzsche's dithyramb Amongst the Daughters of the Desert presents the image of a moral lion roaring before the dancing girls. In a different stanza, one of the girls is said to have lost her leg. In a personal annotation next to this passage, Jung wrote, "Morals has devoured the other leg." At the very end of Zarathustra, just underneath the last paragraph in his personal copy, Jung annotated, "In fact, now one should try to really live the gain knowledge on human nature and not only to think of it. From that, a battle with the lions would arise, and from its overcoming, the poor Eternus, namely the child, would arise." That already means illness, though. This reveals Jung's overall understanding of Nietzsche, even though the comment was probably written at a later stage, as the reference to the poor Eternus seems to suggest. Similar understanding, indeed, emerges from Jung's published writing on the psychology of the unconscious from 1917, where he wrote, "He talked of yea saying and lived an nay. His loathing for man, for the human animal that lived by instinct, was too great. Despite everything, he couldn't swallow the toad he so often dreamed of, and which he feared had to be swallowed. The roaring of Zarathustrian lion drove back into the cavern of the unconscious all the higher men who were clamoring to live." Similar words are also used in the Transcendent Function from 1916. So according to Jung, Nietzsche was not able to face and integrate his instincts. Therefore, his moral lion never allowed him to transform and the child to be born. This connection makes it possible to link the images of the desert and the lion occurring in a few chapters from the Red Book with Jung's confrontation with Nietzsche. In particular, the remains of earlier temples, the anchorite, the red one, first day, are all thematically connected and present other strong Nietzschean elements, such as allusions to a dancing god, just to name one. Therefore, the entire idea of Jung's I confronting his personified instincts while in the desert can be directly related to Nietzsche and consequently understood as a response to his failure. Differently from Nietzsche, Jung decides to take up the challenge, face his instincts, and embrace the process of renewal and self-transformation. These elements will be further developed by Jung in the following years and will culminate with the interpretation of Zarathustra as a representation of Nietzsche's failed individuation in the 30s. In the third part of my book, I dealt with how much impact the Red Book had on Jung's interpretation of Nietzsche in the first 30s, namely in his seminar on Nietzsche's Zarathustra. In particular, in the first few sections, I investigated certain elements that do not quite fit in a correct philosophical interpretation of Nietzsche, but upon which Jung's entire interpretation of Nietzsche's Zarathustra came about. Some such elements are, for example, Zarathustra as a representation of the all-wise man, and the Übermensch and the eternal return in relation to Nietzsche's inflation. Again, comparing certain phrases used by Jung in the seminar with similar ones used within a similar context in the Red Book allowed me to see the connection. The character of Zarathustra does not quite fit into the all-wise man description. However, some comments that Jung makes in the seminar recall comments that he makes on Philemon in the Red Book, and that have helped him develop the archetype of the wise old man in his published writings. Similarly, Jung's understanding of the Übermensch and the eternal return in relation to Nietzsche's inflation makes sense from a depth psychological perspective, but it does not in terms of Nietzsche's philosophy. However, similar images to those used by Jung to comment on those subjects in the seminar were already used by him in the Red Book scrutinies in regards to the necessity of acknowledging the divine element within oneself and in the world, which is precisely the main criticism that Jung makes of Nietzsche and the reason he attributes to Nietzsche's failed individuation. In the last sections of this third part, I investigated a subject that I find particularly interesting. Namely how certain animals that do not play a major role or any relevance whatsoever to a correct understanding of Zarathustra are being explored and analyzed by Jung in a depth psychological framework, such as the serpents, the frogs, and the doves. Again, I'm going to give you an example so you can see better what I'm talking about. While commenting on the Zarathustra chapter of The Other's Bite, Jung claims, "Crush the head of the serpent and he will bite you in the heel." This comment sounds out of place, as there is no mention of heels in Nietzsche's text, even though the heel element is an important one in the biblical tradition. In the second edition of Symbols of Transformation, Jung will make a similar statement in regards to the same chapter. If you want the snake to bruise your heel, you have only to tread on its head. The reference to the heel, however, becomes extremely clear if one thinks of a comment that Jung had made in the Red Book chapter, First Day, a chapter that presents several important allusions to Nietzsche. And the comment reads, "But the poison of the serpent whose head you crush enters you through the wound in your heel, and thus the serpent becomes more dangerous than it was before." It becomes clear that Jung reconnected the serpent's bite from Zarathustra to his reflection about getting bitten by a serpent in the Red Book. Once again, the core of the interpretation is that the divine element should acknowledge its independence from the ego and be integrated within one's personality. Nietzsche never did it, so he failed his individuation. To conclude, it is necessary to let Nietzsche and Jung have an imaginary chess game. As I said at the beginning, a dialogue between Nietzsche and Jung would be impossible because they would speak two radically different languages, reflecting two radically different perspectives. The battlefield of an imaginary fight between Nietzsche and Jung would be Christianity. Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity comes from his philological education. He was a philologist by training, rather than from a personal crisis or loss of faith. Nietzsche never argued that he personally stopped believing in Christianity. He only pointed out that we do not possess any epistemological instrument to argue in favor of metaphysics or God. Jung, on the other hand, adopts an empirical standpoint. He experienced the power of God, his being both good and evil at the same time, as a young boy. While he was coming home from school and saw the newly refurbished roof of Basel Cathedral, and the thought of God defecating on it haunted him for days, till he realized that he had no choice but let that thought come out and experience the power of God. Two opposite perspectives are also adopted in regards to the figure of Christ. Nietzsche has nothing against the historical character of Jesus, and his criticism has to be understood in a political dimension and in the wider context of the decadence. Such criticism is purely directed against Paul and the first Christians, just as his criticisms of Socrates and Wagner are actually directed against Plato and the Wagnerians, respectively. What Nietzsche criticizes is the attitude of the followers who ignore the instinctual element in Jesus' soft nature, Socrates' will to truth, and Wagner's genius, and who turn these instincts into metaphysical truths, into values to be emulated. Jung, by contrast, considers Christ as an archetypal representation of the self, as an eternal truth, carrier of meaning and transformation in any era in time. Lastly, both Nietzsche and Jung give ample consideration to the concept of self-becoming. However, while Nietzsche's idea is to promote self-experimentation and see how much truth one can bear, Jung's attention is directed towards the metaphysical path of the process of individuation, in which certain archetypes are to be encountered, faced, and integrated. Even though the archetypal contents vary from individual to individual, their structure and meaning are always the same, and their nature is a metaphysical one. A dialogue between Nietzsche and Jung could never take place because while Nietzsche is interested in denying the certainty of any metaphysics, Jung comes from a strong metaphysical tradition. It is always Nietzsche as a man to interest Jung, not Nietzsche as a philosopher. Jung's philosophers were Plato, Schopenhauer, and above all, Kant. Ultimately, Jung is not concerned with metaphysical speculations because he is not a philosopher by training. He is interested in how he could practically help his patients as a psychologist. And in this respect, the man Nietzsche is arguably the most helpful figure. According to Jung, Nietzsche became mad because he denied the possibility of a new God being reborn after the old God had been killed. Jung and his patients will save themselves from madness by dedicating their lives to the rebirth of their new God or gods. At the same time, a psychological reading of Zarathustra does not diminish the philosophical value of the text. On the contrary, it enhances it by opening up new perspectives and, to put it with Nietzsche, by transvaluing Nietzsche's own philosophy. So, even though such a dialogue could never take place historically or philosophically, the fruits of such a dialogue are definitely worth picking, not only philosophically, but also psychologically. Thank you very much.
Obrigado, Gaia. Muitas questões para a gente poder pensar junto, né? Acho que tem um material bastante complexo e com uma gama de interpretações, me parece, extremamente novas nessa relação do Jung com Nietzsche. A gente vai abrir para o diálogo agora, para o debate. Quem quiser perguntar, coloca o nome no chat, eu chamo, e eu vou, como de costume, começar. Tá? Queria começar com duas questões. Uma primeira, Gaia, eu queria entender melhor como se dá essa passagem na obra do Jung, e acho que é uma interpretação que você faz, do Jung primeiro pensar o Zarathustra como uma imagem arquetípica do velho sábio, né, quase uma imagem do self, para depois pensar o Nietzsche como esse exemplo de fracasso da individuação. Ou seja, em que momento o filósofo Nietzsche se torna o caso Nietzsche para Jung? Quase um caso clínico, né? de um homem que enlouqueceu. Como é que, na sua interpretação, como é que se deu essa passagem?
Thanks for the question. It's a very good one, and it's quite complex as a topic. So as to Zarathustra as the wise old man, I'm not sure he happens during the Red Book. I don't think he happens at the time of Liber Novus. What I think happens is that towards the end of Liber Novus, in Scrutinies, Jung starts to have more and more precise dialogues with Philemon, in which Zarathustra and especially his role as a teacher are questioned. And I think this process helps Jung shape his idea of the wise old man. So one of the things that actually I find most interesting is the passage. So there's a passage in Scrutinies in which Jung describes the role of the teacher, and he mentions the value of gold, and he says gold wouldn't have any value if there wasn't anyone to give value to gold. So gold per se has no price and no value, but he becomes valuable because we give it some value. And in this passage, there are lots of interesting references to one of the most famous chapters from Zarathustra, which is on the bestowing virtue, in which Zarathustra's role as a teacher is basically explored, even though it's not like a theoretical work, but like it's presented, we can say. And in this chapter, Zarathustra says something like, beware of Zarathustra, because, so beware of all teachers, because teachers might lie to you, and beware of Zarathustra, because Zarathustra is also a teacher. And in this very chapter, the role of so the value of gold is used as an example to describe a virtue that constantly bestows itself upon the others, because the gold has its value because it just has it. And this value, the value of gold, is that gold can constantly give itself to others without extinguishing its its potential. It's like if you allow me this parallel, this metaphor, this comparison, it's a little bit like like Plotinus and his idea of the sun, which has rays that give us energy, and we absorb energy from the rays. And that's different from giving something to someone which is then diminished. And what I find interesting is that Jung reverses this idea. So where Nietzsche puts the value of gold as like the most valuable value, the most valuable virtue, because it gives itself to the others without diminishing its power, Jung uses the same image, the same gold metaphor, but to try and describe precisely the opposite message, the opposite process, because gold wouldn't have any value per se if there weren't any men and women for it to, to attribute value to gold. And the context within this metaphor is used is extremely interesting, because it's the context of teaching in both cases. So, and whereas Nietzsche says, beware of teachers because they can lie to you and they can deceive you, and at the same time uses this metaphor to say, to identify a sort of value that's above all other values. Jung uses the same images to say, beware of value of gold and who believes that gold has any values, because gold wouldn't have values if there wasn't anyone for it to have any value. And so my interpretation is that implicitly Jung suggests that Zarathustra as a teacher wasn't able to, to accept self-mockery and to recognize the shadow. So in this sense, he was kind of craving pupils. He was kind of craving people to emulate him. And he was also being emulated instead of being understood by others, because he lacked this characteristic, because he lacked this acknowledgement of the shadow, and so the element of self-mockery. So Zarathustra wasn't able to mock himself, so he couldn't be fully grasped by his pupil, and that made him also obliged to have pupils, just as gold wouldn't have any value in the same kind of context. And what's even more interesting is that Nietzsche also reads this in connection, that Jung also reads this in connection with Nietzsche's personality. So it's not Zarathustra as a fictional character, but it's Zarathustra as an archetype from, Nietzsche's innermost, unconscious experiences. And even more than this, it's Nietzsche's wise old man archetype with whom he has identified. So it's Nietzsche, it's not just Zarathustra, but it's Nietzsche who needs pupils, who needs an audience, who needs someone, because he's unable to understand his own shadow and to acknowledge the shadow. So this was kind of my response to the first question. So I don't really think Philemon is consciously developed while reading Zarathustra, but I do think that some characterizations of the wise old man that come across later in the years come from this confrontation between Philemon and Zarathustra at the time, in the latest stages of the Red Book. And also, I don't know if you happen to read the Black Books yet, but there are some even more explicit references to Nietzsche in the Black Books, which kind of go towards the same, direction. And again, so the second question was about the self and the idea of inflation, if I'm recalling.
Fracasso da individuação. Do fracasso da individuação.
Right. Yes. So that's really interesting. So basically, Jung's idea is that of Nietzsche as a man who undergoes an archetypical experience. So he's passing by this triangular stone in the lake of Silvaplana in Engadin, Switzerland, and he comes across this idea of the eternal return, this kind of a metaphysical. So that's how Jung interprets it, as a metaphysical symbol. And then then Nietzsche has this experience with Zarathustra, you know, who passes by and the one becomes two. And this is something that Nietzsche reports in a poem, which is entitled Sils Maria. We know that this is actually a fictional poem because there are several re-elaborations in his unpublished notes. But what Jung is really struck with is the archetypal idea of this one becoming two. So Jung's interpretation of Nietzsche is this. Due to his education and maybe, I don't know, even kind of, you know, like, yes, upbringing, education, maybe, you know, personality issues, he was never able to develop a healthy relationship with his anima. So he lacked the connection element with the unconscious. So basically, according to Jung, Nietzsche had a completely underdeveloped anima that would manifest itself either through immature eroticism, such as, you know, like dancing girls, doves, like this kind of eroticism, or through projections, like anima projections and embodiments within the character of Zarathustra. So, for example, Zarathustra seemed to be very much into dancing and, you know, and chanting and singing and, you know, like into poetry. And all these elements, according to Jung, are part of Nietzsche's anima, you know, that couldn't be acknowledged as such, but would be projected and incorporated. So projected onto and incorporated within Zarathustra as a character. So, but the problem with this is that because Nietzsche has such a bad relationship with his anima, he's not ready to, you know, he's not prepared to face the unconscious when it emerges. So the unconscious, and especially the self, would constantly try to come to surface, according to Jung. And according to Jung, Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, for instance, would be a manifestation of the self. I mean, in my opinion, Jung completely misunderstood Jung's idea of the Übermensch, and he kind of relates this idea with his own idea of the Übersinn instead. But that doesn't change anything. So the point being, Nietzsche had these kind of messages from the unconscious, these attempts, you know, from the unconscious to kind of reveal itself and be integrated. But Nietzsche, on the one hand, wasn't ready for it because of the bad relationship he had with his anima. And on the other hand, he constantly kind of rejects this because he does not believe in this kind of reality, according to Jung, which again, I disagree with because that's not the case, but that doesn't matter because that's where Jung's interpretation comes from, and that's what really matters in this context. And also Nietzsche wasn't even, you know, he's never able to accept and integrate the shadow. So for all these reasons, the process of individuation can't take place. And so initially Nietzsche is an introverted and intuitive type. And according to Jung, towards the end of Zarathustra, his attitude is turned into the opposite in what Jung calls Dionysian orgy. Because according to Jung, from the second part of Zarathustra till the end, and then again on till the very end of Nietzsche's life, there's a kind of climax that culminates with the idea of Dionysian and dissolution, which is a representation of an extroverted sensation, still according to Jung. And so this is where the idea of a failed individuation comes from, or if you wanted to summarize it. And so when Nietzsche stops being Nietzsche and becomes the case Nietzsche, in Jung's published writings, this happens around about 1916. So in the writings published prior to 1916, Nietzsche is taken as an example, as someone who had archetypal experiences. And I think Jung was mostly concerned with the mythological element and the collective, element of the unconscious. So if you think about the first edition of Wandlungen from 1912, Nietzsche is cited alongside Hölderlin, because these are examples of poets who, went through collective unconscious experiences. And then both ended up mad, but Jung is not really interested in this at the time. And then, this is my interpretation, Jung starts having, and Jung had already read Zarathustra once in his life, because he had read it as a student towards the very end of the 90s. So, and he already took an interest, as you know, because he recognized an example of cryptomnesia in one chapter from Zarathustra. So he already got in touch with Nietzsche's sister, who invited him to Nietzsche's funeral. So he did have some sort of interest in Nietzsche. And even at the time of his very first reading of Nietzsche, he kind of picks some sort of unconscious and dreadful experience in Zarathustra, according to what's reported in Memories, Dreams, Reflection. We can't say this is 100% accurate, but that's what Jung, says at the end of his life, and that's what we need to kind of believe in, because we have no other testimony for this. So there is an element of dread underpinning Jung's, entire, Jung's lifetime interpretation of Nietzsche. However, Jung is not is not really concerned, with this element until he has the Red Book experience. And the reason why I'm saying this, because my interpretation is this. So he starts having the first visions. He becomes afraid of a psychosis, at the beginning, that he realized that he's got nothing to fear about. And then this kind of confrontation with Nietzsche becomes more and more alive and kind of active. And initially, Nietzsche is just referenced to in some comments. That you don't find much Nietzsche in the first chapters of Liber Novus, other than in comments. So if you divide Liber Novus into layer 1, which is just the plain visions, and layer 2, which is the comments and drawings, paintings, and everything, you find Nietzsche, you find a little bit of Nietzsche in layer 2, but you still don't find a lot of Nietzsche. Then in the 18th of January, 1914, Jung has this vision. And that's when, when something really clicks. And all the following chapters from that moment onwards are not only concerned with madness, because folly and madness become like a real, concerns of Jung's, but also with the idea of, letting a God be reborn again after, the death of God, and with issues which are traditionally more connected with Nietzsche. And I think this culminates with the necessity of reading Zarathustra for the second time towards the end of 1914. And according to what Jung tells us in the seminar on Zarathustra, the reason why he decides to read Nietzsche again is because he's concerned with the self, and he wants to develop his concept of self. So he understands that Nietzsche has some sort of intuition of the self, but he's not able to fully develop this idea, because according to Jung, in Nietzsche, one lacks the idea of unconscious, which is wrong, but that's not relevant now. And so this is when Nietzsche, in my opinion, becomes a case study, because Jung has afraid of ended up mad for a certain time, you know, like I would say even like in the first couple of years upon the first fantasies. So I would say from the end of 1912, 1913 till January 1914. But then he kind of finds the cure for the illness, for this kind of madness. And the cure is to create a new sort of Christianity, which is closer to the original Christianity, to the Christianity of the origins. So when we need to stop believing in the imitation, imitatio Christi, so the imitation of Christ, and we need to live to become Christ. So we need to accept the divine and accept this independence differently from Nietzsche. And then we also need to become this kind of, so we need to let this realize itself differently from Nietzsche. So at that point, Nietzsche becomes, Jung is still interested in Nietzsche because he quotes Nietzsche quite often, but in the 20s, he's more interested in the relationship between Nietzsche and his personality, because Jung is writing about personality. Then he becomes more interested in the relationship between Nietzsche and his contemporary, era and authors, because Jung becomes more interested in the idea of collective unconscious as in relation to its prophetical message and also to the collectivity. And then Jung becomes more interested in totalitarianisms. So Nietzsche as a prophet of, World War II and so forth. So Jung never stops, being interested in Nietzsche, but Nietzsche becomes an example, becomes a case study, like a clinical case after 1914 and for sure 1916. I hope this answered the question. And there was another question, but I can't remember anymore.
Ótimo. Ótimo, Gaia, obrigado. A gente tem uma série de perguntas, Gaia, tá bom? Vamos lá. Lu Ximenes, por favor.
Gaia, tudo bem? Muito obrigada pela sua profunda explicação. Eu fiquei bastante confusa com muitas coisas, eu vou tentar fazer aqui uma pergunta. Primeiro, são duas perguntas. Primeiro, eu me interesso muito de saber a sua opinião, sim. Você fala o tempo todo, minha opinião importa, né? Eu quero muito saber qual é a sua interpretação sobre tudo isso. Por que você discorda do Jung? Agora, a pergunta que eu tinha feito, que eu vou tentar me organizar aqui, acho que tem a ver com essa coisa da individuação que você estava trazendo, tentando juntar com a nossa clínica. Você termina a tua apresentação dizendo da loucura do Nietzsche, que o Jung ele se preocupa mais com a prática clínica e com ajudar os seus pacientes. Então, foi nesse momento que ele se perdeu um pouco na interpretação do Zarathustra, né? Pelo que eu entendi, em brevíssimas palavras. E eu queria saber o que você acha que esse teu estudo pode nos ajudar na análise do inconsciente na clínica. Não sei se fica clara a pergunta.
So thanks for this question. It's quite, that's a complicated one to answer, but that's a good one. I don't know, I'm not sure. I'm a historian by by training, because I studied philosophy and I'm a historian of philosophy. So I think I'm just trying to deconstruct and reconstruct certain topics historically, and I think that by so doing, some Jungian elements can gain a different perspective, a different nuance So, for example, it's quite common among the Jungians. I mean, I don't know, I don't mean to offend anyone, just, you know, based on my experience, every time I came across, you know, some Jungians, they would always ask me about Nietzsche's madness, because most of them would kind of believe that what Jung wrote, well, he didn't write, but what Jung argued in the seminar corresponds to, you know, to reality and to the actual situation about Nietzsche. And so my hope is to provide a different view and say that actually, yes, I mean, that it might be the case, because I'm not saying Nietzsche wasn't inflated or Nietzsche wasn't, it's actually very possible that that Jung, you know, guessed it right about Nietzsche to a certain extent. But my interest is more in showing kind of the background of this interpretation and all the many layers that this interpretation has. And so the first reading of Nietzsche, and then we have the Red Book, and then we have the second reading of Nietzsche. And so we have a kind of a personal transformation within Jung himself, which then takes him to retrospectively reread Nietzsche's Zarathustra in connection to his own understanding and personal growth. So these are interrelated, and I think my only wish, my only hope, you know, if there's anything that I can do, that my contribution can do to the Jungian world, is to show how much more complex this relationship is that it might appear, and how much, you know, how interlaced the Red Book and seminars on Zarathustra are in relation to Nietzsche's interpretation of, to Jung's interpretation of Nietzsche. And obviously Nietzsche is not the only one, you know, is not the only target of the Red Book, because you have the figure of Christ, and you have a lot of, you know, elements from German idealism, and you have, there are quite a few references that I found to Spittler, or as Paul Bishop has found, to Fischer as well. So yeah, I'm not saying, like, you know, Nietzsche is the only one. There are lots of references, and there are a lot of commonalities as well with Dante's Commedia. So it's not just Nietzsche, but I'm talking about Nietzsche. Someone else will talk about someone else. I don't know. I have this idea that the Red Book had a huge impact on you know, how other Jungian concepts were shaped afterwards. I don't think, I mean, this is my opinion, and I know it's shared by Sonu Shandasani as well. I also know that not everyone agrees on this, because there's someone who says the Red Book is not relevant to, you know, understanding to understand Jung's later philosophy. I disagree, but, you know, like, this is just my view. I think it's much more important than one could think. And even, I mean, and just as important are the Black Books, because both the Red Book and the Black Books show Jung's innermost kind of, you know, experiences during a, you know, particular time frame. I don't know if this answers your question in any way.
Não, foi ótimo, obrigada.
Obrigado, Lu. Vamos lá. Arthur, contigo, meu amigo.
Olá, Gaia, olá, grupo. Queria agradecer a palestra, ao Tiasos, e queria tentar formular duas perguntas, né? A primeira pergunta seria mais ou menos assim: o que caracteriza uma obra visionária, né? O que caracteriza uma obra que tem o seu produto, né? A sua produção vinda do inconsciente, né? E não só, quer dizer, como argumentar aos críticos que colocam o Livro Vermelho como uma obra talvez mais personalista do que uma produção do próprio inconsciente, né? Essa é a primeira questão, assim, né? Porque deu o exemplo de Fausto, do Goethe, deu o exemplo do Zarathustra, mas e o Livro Vermelho, né? E a outra questão que eu gostaria de fazer seria mais ou menos o seguinte, sobre a questão do niilismo. O Nietzsche parece fazer um diagnóstico de época em que percebe o niilismo em toda a cultura europeia, e talvez a gente possa estender essa questão do niilismo a toda a situação que o mundo vive hoje, né? E o Nietzsche parece propor a superação do niilismo pelo próprio niilismo. Então, não por fora do niilismo, né? E eu fico pensando também no papel da psicologia analítica, no papel do Jung, porque o Jung, no Livro Vermelho, questiona as imagens, questiona os deuses, e se os deuses estão sendo questionados, é porque eles deixaram de ser tão absolutos assim. Então, até que ponto o Jung não lida com a mesma questão, né? Seria possível o processo de individuação sem a morte de Deus, né? Seria um pouco essa questão assim. O Livro Vermelho é uma resposta também ao niilismo. São, né? Mais ou menos essas questões.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. So to answer so these are very deep questions, and I'll try to do my best to answer them, not sure. So to answer the first question, I'm gonna screen share a chapter from my book, just because the quotation is just there. Sorry, this is introduction. This one. Sorry. Yeah. So which is the definition that Jung provides of visionary works. And I think that's the best source to understand what Jung understands with visionary works. So he divides, the mode of artistic creation, that's what he calls it, within psychological and visionary. So everything that's written consciously, it's psychological. So for instance, in Ulysses Joyce, or the first part of Goethe's Faust, and many other, writings, they have been written consciously with a certain intent. So they can be considered psychological because their contents are quite familiar to their authors. The visionary works, by contrast, are characterized by crucial experiences, powerful emotions, suffering, passions, the stuff of human fate in general. And there's an element of unheimlich, as Freud would say. There's something that we can, recognize within these works. And so they leave us with a jolly or with a feeling of discomfort. And Jung says that the raw material of this kind of creation is derived from the contents of a man's, okay. No, sorry, I was reading because Jung is a little bit like, when he presents subjects, he is quite, so let me just jump down to the second part. So the gulf that separates the first, so the experience that furnishes the material of artistic expression is no longer familiar. It is something strange that derives its existence from the hinterlands of man's mind. And you see, as if it had emerged from the abyss of pre-human ages, or from a superhuman world of contrasting light and darkness. He calls it a primordial experience which surpasses man's understanding, and to which, in his weakness, he may easily succumb. So this is the definition he provides in the 30s. And it's not easy to, Jung is not a very systematic thinker because he's a psychologist. So even though he had a strong humanistic education, and he would arguably place himself within a humanistic tradition, he's not interested in, speculating about philosophy or literary studies. So he provides us with this definition here, but he doesn't go much, he doesn't expand the definition with the same name in other writings. But if you compare how he describes these visionary works in this definition from 1930 with how he describes other works, for example, in 1921 in the Psychological Types, you can find that there are similar elements that are connected together, and the interpretation could fit as well. And we know this because Jung himself states that the list could go on and on. I can't find the right quotation here, but he writes again, he says, these are just a few examples of the works, but the list could go on and on. And yeah, so in Psychological Types, when Jung talks about the relativity of the symbol, he dwells upon, again, Nietzsche, Wagner, Dante, and Goethe. So it's like a thread, that repeats itself. And then there are other, additions to the list. There are many others, obviously. I wasn't interested in them because they didn't share similar educational background or other commonalities with Zarathustra and Nietzsche. So I was interested in those who actually could give us something more about this tradition, and also those that Jung puts together in the seminar on Zarathustra, which is why I narrowed down the list to only 4 of them. So this is the definition that Jung provides us with. And so this is where my idea of visionary works, arises. So I don't really think, so you said that the Red Book is like Jung's experience with his own intimacy, and I 100% agree with this. But I don't see how this shouldn't be, I don't see the objection to the Red Book being considered a visionary work, even if it was described as Jung's experiencing his own intimacy, because you still find symbolism, like eternal symbols. You still find a lot of mythological references. You still find prophetical elements. You still find a religion. You still find many elements that are common to those works. And also, I'm not analyzing visionary works in terms of their actual experience with the unconscious, because I don't have the instruments to do that, because I'm not an analyst, and even if I was, I wouldn't be able to analyze their authors. So I cannot only give an external, opinion on those texts based on what I see. So these texts, they can all be described as experiences of their authors with their own intimacy. And we know this because we have letters, like I didn't mention all this part, but we do have letters, and other notes, references. So the way these authors considered their works is pretty similar to what you just called, an experience with your own intimacy. So not different from Jung's own experience. And then on the other hand, Jung also re-elaborates his fantasies in a more conscious way, which still, again, recalls the way these visionary authors do. So this attention to, to the style, to the language, even though Jung's style does not sound like a poetic style, because he's not a poet. He's just a man, you know, trying to write down his fantasies and to interpret them. But still, there is a sort of a poetical strive, a sort of, you know, attempt to create a musicality and to re-elaborate the text, and then to add some comments. And so I don't see why that this shouldn't be considered a visionary works according to Jung's definition. And but this is my opinion, like this is my understanding, and you know, I know other people who share my view, but that doesn't have to be the only one, of course. And yes, I do agree with you on the second question. I think the Red Book is an attempt by Jung to overcome nihilism. I honestly don't see why it shouldn't be. I guess my point is a different one. So yes, you correctly said that Nietzsche said that in order to overcome nihilism, we have to face it and not to deny it. Absolutely, 100%. And indeed, there's a difference between passive and active nihilism. So passive nihilism is the last man or the higher man nihilism, is when we realize we are in a nihilistic reality, but we suffer and we're not able to face it, we're not able to overcome it. And then there's the Übermensch. The Übermensch is nihilism, which is the active nihilism, and which is being able to face the death of God and to create new values, you know, upon this. And the difference that I see in, you know, between Nietzsche and Jung on this is that whereas Jung doesn't seem to accept any other possibility of creating new values, if not by letting a new God be born again, Nietzsche gives you complete freedom, which doesn't necessarily mean that this is true, because then Jung might be right and we all might, you know, fail if we wanted to create new values without God. And also Nietzsche doesn't say you shouldn't create, you know, a new God ever again in your life. It just I think it just wants to put a little bit of focus on the fluidity of morals, and on the fact that, you know, morals is something that is something that is dynamic and it's not static, and that values have been created and you know, over the years, and then there is a strong component coming from our need to socialize and to live you know, within a society. And so we need to, there's a kind of a struggle, you know, between human nature and social living. So we do have to acknowledge that we are animals and we live according, you know, to instincts on the one hand, but we also have to understand that we can't go back to living as animals. And so that's where values come from in a Nietzschean perspective. So Nietzsche says, and again, I mean, now I'm just really summarizing because there would be much more to say about this, but so the diagnosis he does of the decadence is this: the decadence is a nil society, because they do realize that God is sick or dead, but they do nothing. They can't go on. They can't overcome this situation. And yes, maybe the Red Book is one of the way to, you know, is an attempt to overcome nihilism. Why not? But I think Nietzsche wants us to adopt a little bit of a broader point of view. So yes, the Red Book can be one, but it doesn't have to be the only one. So that's where I see a difference, but that's just my view and just pure speculation.
Obrigado, Arthur. Pessoal, vamos lá. Eu vou pedir um favor. A gente tem várias perguntas. Eu vou pedir para que as perguntas sejam sucintas para dar tempo. Não, você não, Gaia, você fica à vontade. Só que as perguntas sejam mais sucintas para dar tempo de todo mundo perguntar, tá bom? Paula Perrone, por favor, Paula.
Olá, Gaia, muito obrigada por transmitir para nós elementos tão ricos, né, da sua leitura entre os dois autores, da compreensão entre os dois, e esses momentos diferentes que você está mostrando para a gente. Acho que agora vai ser muito mais possível a gente poder compreender melhor o seminário, né, de Jung, do Zarathustra. Então, eu queria te perguntar, essa ideia da individuação do Jung, né, do tornar-se quem se é, que a gente sabe que ele trouxe do Nietzsche, como que seria, daria para a gente pensar a diferença de compreensão entre os dois a respeito dessa ideia?
Yeah, that's another very broad question. So I'll try to be as brief as possible. And I mean, they do have some similarities for sure. And so the main difference that I would see is that the process of individuation has some sort of metaphysical, nuance in it, because the archetypes are always the same, even though the contents are different, but there is a path to be followed, which might or might not lead to, self-individuation. And on the other hand, you have Nietzsche's idea of becoming who you are, as he expresses it in Ecce Homo, where you have this idea of constantly, self-experimenting. So trying to carry on with mental experiments, like thought experiments, and so to never stagnate within one perspective, but always to try and embrace as many different perspectives as possible, and to bear as much truth as possible. And I also think that the idea of the death of God and also the idea of the eternal return belong to this kind of perspective. They're both kind of thought experiments. It's like, how radical can you really be? How radical can you really live? So I think this is the difference, the main difference between Jung's idea of individuation and Nietzsche's idea of self-becoming. So I don't think it doesn't mean that you have to be, so that you can't be radical in Jung's idea of individuation, because individuation at the end of the day means become who you are. So if yourself, if in your nature is this element of radicalism, and if your integration of conscious and unconscious element leads you to this being radical, I think Nietzsche's idea of self-becoming can be regarded as a sort of individuation. But not everyone, according to Jung, he's made to live a radical life. I'm thinking about, I don't know, if someone has been brought up with really strong Catholic values, for instance, they might not be open enough to experiment with the death of God, and it might not even be beneficial for their own individuation process. So that's how I consider the difference. I don't know if it answers your question, or if you have something more specific that you wanted me to answer.
Ótima a sua resposta, muito obrigada, acrescentou bastante.
Obrigado, Paula. Vamos lá, Pedro Henrique, por favor.
Oi, Gaia, muito obrigada. Eu fiquei pensando assim, acho que minha pergunta vai bastante na linha da pergunta da Lu, Eu fiquei pensando também nesse finalzinho, quando você vai pensando a loucura de Nietzsche, como o velho Deus morreu, o novo Deus não nasceu, né? Ou você falou mais cedo também de que para Jung, Nietzsche teria ficado no leão, não teria nascido criança. Mas aí eu não pensei só na clínica, eu pensei em tudo que o mundo tem vivido, enfim, em cada cultura a seu modo, mas o mundo tem vivido. Desde Nietzsche, parece que cada vez mais intensamente, né? Assim, principalmente depois do fim do século passado, talvez. E não sei, o que a gente pode aprender dessa conversa impossível de Jung e Nietzsche para tudo isso que a gente tem vivido?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think that there are a host of philosophers who have been trying to see what we can do after Nietzsche, you know, in the latest part of the centuries, of the 20th century. And now even more, of course, it becomes important to reflect upon this. What can we do? I think, honestly, what I've been trying to do over the past maybe 10 years or even more, or I don't know, is to try and put Jung and Nietzsche together, like in my life, and try to see what I can do, you know, like, and I've been trying to make the most of each. And because I'm a Nietzschean by training, but I obviously don't share, like, you know, I'm not like, I obviously reject dogmatism. So there are some elements, you know, in Nietzsche that has to be overcome for sure. And even the quest for spirituality has, you know, the thing is, I think Nietzsche's idea of the death of God has to be put in context when the time it came from. Now, you know, it's already been overcome. So even a return to spirituality, as Jung claims for, I think is crucial for us, and we probably need to become more spiritual. And so I would say we should try and maybe live as radical as possible on the one hand. Like I think that's the biggest teaching that we can learn from Nietzsche. So we need to become, you know, bearer of truth. We need to try and live with the most radical thoughts we are capable of as humans. And, you know, because this gives us an open mind. You know, Nietzsche was a skeptical. I think he would belong in, you know, in skepticism in terms of philosophical traditions. And I think that's one of the best teachings you can, you know, ever give to someone as a teacher. But then on the other hand, we have the, you know, Jung's spiritual element, which I think is really, really important in our society. It doesn't have to be the original God, like from Christianity, or doesn't necessarily have to be that God, but at least you know, the sense of acknowledging that we belong to something greater than just ourselves can help us put everything, you know, in perspective. And I don't know if you guys ever happen to have this kind of, you know, feelings and thoughts when you see people really fighting and arguing about such a stupid, you know, and small issue, and you think, but don't these people know that there's much more than this in life? Don't these people ever, you know, think that theirs is just a small narrow perspective, and actually it could be wrong? Like, you know, and I think both Nietzsche and Jung try to help us, you know, embrace this wider perspective. So I think Jung might be right in analyzing Nietzsche as an inflated man. He's wrong in considering Zarathustra as a representation of his failed individuation, probably, I mean, arguably. And he's maybe wrong in considering Nietzsche's madness starting already at the time of Zarathustra, because it's not the case. But there might for sure be some signs of inflation in Nietzsche. No one, I think, would ever argue against, because that there were. And so, I mean, using Jung's interpretation of Nietzsche's madness could help us prevent from, becoming like this. And also, it makes sense whether his interpretation is, accurate or not, because the point remains. So maybe trying to embrace, to adopt a little bit of a wider perspective and embrace totality can help us, live better in this post-modern society. So that would be my takeaway, I guess. I don't know if it answers your question. You're all asking me quite tough questions, so I'm just doing my best.
Tudo bem, Pedro? Obrigado, amigo. Gaia, tá ótimo, tá ótimo. A gente tem mais alguma série de perguntas. Podemos ir? Podemos avançar? Vamos lá, Wagner. Contigo, Wagner.
Oi, tá dando para ouvir direitinho?
Perfeito.
Beleza. Gaia, prazer em conhecê-la. Fiquei bastante feliz com a sua fala. E eu vou mais ou menos na pergunta, na mesma linha tanto do Arthur quanto do Pedro Henrique, né, que abordaram ou fizeram uma leitura, um olhar sobre o atual, o homem contemporâneo, né? Nós queremos trazer, né, o olhar de Jung e Nietzsche para o homem contemporâneo, né? Então a gente, toda a sua fala me trouxe uma reflexão muito importante, né, que eu diria, né? Que no momento atual, né, trazendo a fala, né, o dizer sim para os instintos, né, e a gente curiosamente vê na atualidade uma ambiguidade, né? Ou seja, por um lado a gente percebe uma natureza instintiva negada, ou seja, permitindo uma exacerbação das tradições e do conservadorismo. E, por outro lado, nós podemos identificar também uma natureza instintiva sobrevalorizada, né? Há exemplo aí, né, de casos de estupro à mulher, né, pedofilia, já emergência de ditaduras a nível aí de alguns países, inclusive aqui, né, infelizmente aqui no nosso, né? E eu gostaria de perguntar a você o seguinte, Gaia, que, na sua opinião mesmo, tranquilo, é só uma conversa, né? Que pistas Nietzsche e Jung oferecem para a gente para que a gente possa considerar a natureza instintiva sem, no entanto, que a gente caia numa enantiodromia. Eu acho que esse é um desafio, né, para o homem contemporâneo, né? Como considerar a natureza instintiva dentro do seu correto prisma, mas sem, no entanto, cair numa enantiodromia. O que a gente pode pensar sobre o assunto? Obrigado.
Thank you very much for this question and for your reflection, which is very clever. Yeah, I think both Nietzsche and Jung actually do deal with this problem. So Nietzsche doesn't quite do it in Zarathustra, so he does mention this a little bit, but Zarathustra is a fictional work, is kind of a novel, so he's more interested in using a poetic language to express certain concepts, but then he also elaborates these concepts in other writings. And but he does address this issue a couple of times. And so his idea is precisely as you said, that on the one hand, we need to acknowledge our instinctual nature. But then on the other hand, there's no going back to nature, just as there's no going back to Greece, because Nietzsche always puts these high Greek ideals, but we're not the Greeks. So we're not animals, we're not cavemen, and we're not the Greeks either. So there's a very beautiful aphorism that he wrote at the end of Human or to Human, which is called As Europeans. And basically it's about this. It's about becoming more like extra-European, becoming like adopting a broader perspective, and overcoming like the narrowness of our own kind of stick, you know, rigid perspective. So Nietzsche argues against those who advocate, like, you know, the Russian nihilism, anything goes. So God is dead, anything goes. And Nietzsche advocates against this position because that's not doable. That won't lead us anywhere. So even if you think about the Übermensch, who is this kind of ideal man who has overcome you know, the decadence and has learned to accept life, to say yes to life, so to affirm rather than negate life and instincts, and also to accept the eternal return, which is the most radical hypothesis. Even if you think about this man lives according to the amor fati, which is this idea of embracing and accepting one's own destiny. So the Übermensch has accepted what Nietzsche calls the Dionysian, but is not an uncontrollable Dionysian man as those, you know, from the rituals, from the Greek rituals. He's not that kind of man. He resembles more a man from the Renaissance. He's like a highly educated man, well, you know, very measured and balanced, who can overcome all this totality of the Dionysian, all the perspectives, and he can carry all of them, you know, within himself, and he can choose which perspective to use, you know, each time. He can choose, he can create his own values without struggling against and fighting against God, because he's not angry anymore. Like, you know, he knows that God is dead. He has created new values, but also without even being like a camel, you know, which bears and you know, the values as a truth, anti-life. So he doesn't. So the Übermensch is not against life, but he's not the camel and he's not the lion. He's the child. He's like a third element of you know, of renewal and reborn. And this is from a Nietzschean perspective. And then obviously I would say from a Jungian perspective, it's the idea of integration. So I think it all comes down to, you know, recognizing and integrating the shadow, which is possibly one of the hardest, you know, tasks that we face every day, because the shadow is always there. But I think once we learn this, we can then move on and you know, and accept this kind of totality, because we need to accept and embrace and integrate the instincts. We can't, you know, reject them. We can't deny the instincts because they exist. But obviously we can't even live by instinct because we're more developed than that. So I think it all comes down with creating a healthy relationship with the shadow. But I don't know, that's my, you know, my opinion. This is how I would personally answer the question. And you are Jungian, so you have a more, like definitely a better idea, you know, than mine, for sure. Yeah.
Obrigado, Gaia. Muito obrigado. Muito esclarecedor. Obrigado.
Obrigado, Wagner. Abraço, amigo. Punita Miranda, querida Punita. Amiga de Gaia de Fanes.
É
né?
isso. Oi, Gaia. Obrigada pela sua pesquisa. Eu tenho que ler seu livro. A minha questão aqui eu acho que eu não conheço Nietzsche, né? A minha questão é mais pelo Livro Vermelho mesmo e na experiência do que se deu com Jung. Como ele mesmo se coloca como um caso de estudo no Layer 2. Ele mesmo se coloca nessa posição quando ele, antes dele encontrar Esdubar, que ele vê que a ciência e aonde ele estava até agora feriu o Deus dele. isso traz uma transformação no Jung. Eu tenho a impressão de que ali ele poderia realmente ter, com a ciência dele, matado Stubar. E ali seria um outro livro vermelho, seria uma outra questão. E ele não consegue fazer isso. Então eu acho que nesse turning point ali, quando Jung fica compassivo com relação ao Deus, que é um gigante, e que ele foi tão capaz de machucar esse gigante, ele fala, eu não posso abandonar o meu Deus. Eu não quero ficar sem ele. Então eu acho que nessa questão assim eu não digo nem da dependência, mas dessa escolha. Ali tem uma escolha, eu tenho a impressão. E que o Jung decide essa falta era muito grande para ele não conseguiu fazer isso. Quando você fala dessa questão metafísica, eu acho que isso é uma coisa muito importante mesmo, que ele vai incubar esse Deus. E ali é onde existe a possibilidade, não digo nem do cristianismo, mas de recuperar a experiência do divino em si, que foi o que o cristianismo roubou depois, né? Que o protestantismo veio liberar isso, né? Você tem que ter a experiência do divino. E aí eu acho que nessa hora o Jung traz essa questão da revitalização do cristianismo aí. Você tem a opção, Deus está morto, você pode inclusive se livrar, mas para uns essa perda é muito grande. E eu tenho a impressão que aí a psicologia analítica, depois do Livro Vermelho, vem como que oferecer uma alternativa radical, que eu diria, você pode usar isso assim, nós não precisamos mais do divino. Mas para aqueles que gostariam, existe uma possibilidade de incubar esse Deus ferido, esse Deus morto, e ver o que acontece com a pessoa, né? Então eu sinto que aí, para gerações futuras, o Jung traz essa possibilidade de ter uma experiência que não é religiosa, mas é de uma integração, como você mesma falou, né? Que depois isso vai aparecer no Resposta a Jó, dessa parceria do homem com o divino, como é que é muito importante essa conexão. O homem sobe, ele não está mais subserviente a Deus. Eu cheguei num ponto que eu posso me despojar de você, mas eu vou escolher essa relação, né? Então eu sinto que nesse momento o Livro Vermelho traz essa ferramenta para os indivíduos aí, né? Era só um comentário, eu queria que você falasse um pouco sobre isso, se você sentiu isso na sua pesquisa, nessa coisa, nesse contraponto do livro Vermelho em relação à morte de Deus do Nietzsche. Obrigada.
Thanks, Punita, for this question. Well, it's not really a question, it's more of an add-on, and really thank you because it enriches the discussion. And I couldn't agree with you more. And it's really interesting that you mentioned the choice element. So the fact that we can choose so once God is dead, we don't necessarily have to let the old God, be reborn, but we can choose the divine element to be incorporated in our life. And it's also interesting that you mentioned the poison in the Isdubar element, because that's another crypto, or not really crypto, reference to Nietzsche, because in the gay science, there's an aphorism which is called the poison of the sciences, something like that. I can't remember. Yeah, and that's a reference to that aphorism, because in the aphorism, indeed, science is considered as a poison, because if you become too rational, so if you become too extreme in your logos and in your rationalism, you'll end up being poisoned, because it will kill you, it will turn you against your original, your wholeness. And especially because you would see the problem from the Sinn, but you would miss the Unsinn. So you would never, be allowed to the Übersinn, the supreme meaning. And so that's relevant, because that episode, the Itzdubar episode, is really strongly connected with Zarathustra, and in my opinion is one of the few responses, the direct responses to Nietzsche in the Red Book. And yes, so rationalism kills God, because you become, if you start thinking about the death of God, there's no room for God to live again, because there's no other element. As Nietzsche wrote in another writing, Christianity per se has already the element of self-destruction rooted within itself, because Christianity places the value of truth and truthfulness above other values. So you have to be after truth in order to call yourself a Christian. But then once you find the truth is that the Christianity can't exist in a logical way. So from a logical perspective, that would be a contradiction. But obviously, if you adopt a different perspective, maybe perhaps a mystic perspective, you can see, you can kind of go around the problem and still be a Christian. And my question for you, because now I have a question for you, is would you consider this kind of experience as a mystic, like as a form of mysticism, or how would you consider this experience in Christianity once you choose to still be, well, not necessarily Christianity, but the divine, once you choose to keep this element after God has been killed, in your opinion, in your understanding?
Eu vou te responder como pessoa e o que eu vejo na minha clínica, assim, né? No meu caso, eu fui criada como católica no Brasil. E, através da terapia, eu simplesmente não precisei mais do divino que eu recebi. E foi uma liberação profunda. Mas o que aconteceu aí, que eu acho que foi problemático, foi que o chão metafísico que me sustentava rompeu. E isso deu uma série de problemas que eu só fui identificar depois. E com a psicologia do Jung, eu fui entender, quando você fala desse elemento metafísico, que a ideia do self como um conceito abstrato, mas como um placeholder. Algo se ordenou ali dentro, com os anos, demorou muitos anos mesmo. Então, assim, não diria que foi uma experiência mística, mas, assim, nesse sentido, eu acho que esse espaço de perda e de desorientação que levou, tem algo faltando. E eu sinto que o Jung complementa, porque ele vem pela porta dos fundos, ele não vem apresentando um Deus, ele vem dizendo, existe essa falta dentro de você, e aí você pode acolher da sua forma, é uma religiosidade privada, né? E assim, na clínica eu vejo muito isso também, das pessoas tentando articular uma falta, e nos sonhos, sendo como se fosse refurbished, né? O universo interno. É o contato com esse simbólico que as pessoas estão trazendo, e que isso traz uma redenção da alma, redemption of the soul. Tem algo que eles conectam dentro deles mesmos. E eu sinto isso muito belo, dentro da prática clínica, que seria uma coisa secular. Eu vejo esses momentos assim, a pessoa tem um sonho que de repente ela entende algo que veio da infância e que está apontando para o futuro, e isso cria uma conexão muito forte com ela mesma. E então, assim, eu acho muito belo, e eu acho que esses dois momentos, esse do Nietzsche, da morte de Deus, e a possibilidade do divino acontecer, dessa conexão com o divino reacontecer, é maravilhoso. Esses dois, assim, esses dois polos, porque é justamente onde a gente está, mas tem que vir da escolha, e a escolha, no meu caso, e no caso dos pacientes, vem pelo sofrimento. Vem um sofrimento, vem uma neurose, vem uma desorganização, e aos poucos isso vai encaixando no caminho, né? Obrigada.
Obrigado, Punita. Gaia, vamos começar a terminar, tá? Começando o término. Lorena, com você, minha amiga.
Então, Gaia, primeiro, obrigada pela palestra. Na verdade, eu tenho milhares de perguntas, mas eu vou fazer somente uma pergunta pequena. Quando você fala dessa diferenciação que Jung faz entre as obras visionárias e as obras psicológicas, dentro da sua perspectiva, uma obra visionária, à medida que ela é assimilada pela cultura, à medida que ela é interpretada, à medida que ela é compartilhada com o social, ela deixa de se tornar visionária?
So I think it would still be visionary if it happened. However, according to Jung's interpretation, that this can't happen because almost by definition, a visionary work is often misunderstood by the contemporaries. And that's also what happened to Zarathustra, what happened to the Red Book, and what happened to the second part of Faust and other works. And so Nietzsche withdrew the few copies of the last part of Zarathustra that he had published. So he had them published and delivered to some of his friends, but then he, changed his mind and got those copies back because he reckoned that people weren't ready yet for this message. And the same, as you know, Jung never published the Red Book, even though he did think about, publishing it a few times, but then he never made this conscious decision because possibly his career would have, been undermined or at least considered, differently. But also because that's a tough book to understand, as a reader. So that's a very beautiful question, the one that you asked, and I would definitely invite to reflect a little bit more in detail, which I can't do now. So my answer is just this. I think they would probably still remain visionary, and also because they might possibly disclose even further layers of interpretation. So like, even though you familiarize yourself with those symbols, then, the work opens up new symbols and then they become obscure and then you need to, interpret them even more. But I don't know, because by definition, according to what Jung thinks, usually these works are not well, received within society and, mainstream culture. So, but that's a very, very interesting question. All interesting questions, actually. Thanks for all the questions that have been asked today.
Obrigado, Lorena. Gaia, vou finalizar com duas questões para você, tá? A primeira, eu queria um pouco mudar a direção e te perguntar o seguinte: o que os nietzschianos falam de nós junguianos? Ou seja, como é que os nietzschianos pensam ou recebem essa leitura junguiana sobre Nietzsche? O que você teria a dizer sobre isso?
Okay. So, you know, everyone knows that Nietzsche has been widely misunderstood, but I would say that Jung has also been widely misunderstood. And Jung doesn't have, you know, a good fame within the Nietzschean society, or, you know, within the Nietzschean scholarship. But I'm a little bit in between because I'm a historian of both. So when I'm amongst Nietzscheans, they all consider me Jungian. And when I'm amongst Jungians, like, I can't help, you know, but be Nietzschean. So I mean, they do appreciate the connection that has been explored, for sure, but they don't really have an in-depth knowledge of Jung. Or maybe not yet, maybe it's still too soon, because if you think about it, the first, you know, exhaustive studies on Jung and Nietzsche came out at the end of the 80s, early 90s, and still there were just a few of them and were not very detailed. So it wasn't until the beginning of, maybe 1995 with the Dionysian Self by Paul Bishop, and then from 2000 onwards. So if you think about it, it's still a relatively recent kind of topic.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but the dialogue is kind of opening up slowly. It's coming about.
Ó, a pergunta derradeira agora. O que é mais difícil, Gaia? Estudar a questão do eterno retorno em Nietzsche, em alemão, entender o conceito de self em Jung, ou ter um corpo em boa forma, como você propõe no seu trabalho de fitness? Qual dessas três tarefas é a mais impossível?
Whoa. So no, the last one is definitely achievable. So especially if you work with me. No, I'm joking. But I don't know, between the eternal return, especially in German, and the idea of the self, I think both ideas are quite often misunderstood, and sometimes they are oversimplified, and which makes no justice to, you know, any of them. I think the eternal return is something that has to be grasped in a sort of a mystical experience to you know, just to reconnect to what Punita just said about the divine dimension of the, you know, I mean, about the dimension of the experience with the divine. And but then you have the concept of the self in the new Jungian way, which is which is not an easy one to grasp, because I think he kind of makes you wonder where the divine element is in this connection as well. And then he kind of opens a whole lot of questions, like, you know, and a new, even heavier dimension. I think they're equally difficult. Sorry, that's I can't choose between the eternal return and the self. But they're two of the most fascinating concepts that you can ever come across in life, I think, for sure. For sure. Yeah. And can I, before you conclude, can I say something? I really wish to thank you all. Because this was the first time I ever presented this book, because the book came out in 2019. Wow. And I had a very, you know, busy schedule at work. So I decided to postpone till the beginning of 2020. And then, you know, 2020 happened. And so I never, you know, got the chance to really present this book, you know, in public. And so this gave me the, you know, the perfect chance to do it. And I really, really wish to thank all of you for your questions, because I wasn't expecting so many really, interesting questions and so deep questions. I mean, I was expecting, some questions, but this kind of, such a deep level of engagement is like astonishing to me. So really, really thank you. I'm humbled and super grateful.
Para nós é um imenso prazer, um grande orgulho saber que nós fomos a sua primeira plateia nesse sentido de ouvir a tua apresentação, Gaia. Eu teria uma série de questões para fazer, questão do corpo, a questão Nietzsche, Goethe, a personalidade número 2, mas vamos deixar isso para um próximo encontro. Queria agradecer a tua gentileza, a tua disponibilidade. A gente está há 1h30 conversando, não é um tempo qualquer. Obrigado pela tua paciência conosco, pela tua pesquisa, que me parece uma pesquisa muito singular, muito particular. Acho que ela inaugura um campo de investigação da relação do Jung com Nietzsche diferente dos estudos anteriores. É uma imensa alegria te receber. Muito obrigado pela tua presença. Tá bom? Pessoal, Gaia, quer falar mais alguma coisa? Quer se despedir?
I mean, I couldn't be happier about how this, event has gone. So I've got nothing more to say. I would love to, to follow you guys, again sometime in the future. If you have any interesting events, I wouldn't mind to take part in them again. And I would love to have more debate with you. It was a real unique experience and a huge pleasure and honor. And I feel really blessed. And yes, and also happy Easter, just in terms about renewal and rebirth of God. So the most, I think today is really the perfect day for this kind of a topic. So really thank you and happy Easter to all of you.
Talvez seja a própria experiência da sincronicidade. Você vir falar desses temas hoje, num sábado de Páscoa. Muito obrigado. Gaia, quando você publicar o seu novo livro, nos avise também. E a gente convida você para a gente conversar um pouco mais. Tá bom? Tudo de bom para você. Boa sorte. Pessoal, obrigado pela presença. Boa Páscoa. Isa, você foi maravilhosa. 1h30 conversando e traduzindo com habilidade. Um beijo enorme em você, Isa. Luciana Ximenes, obrigado pela parceria. Boa Páscoa. E pessoal, sábado que vem, sexta que vem, Susan Rowland, tá? Conosco aqui. Bom feriado, boa ressurreição. Até a próxima. Tchau, tchau.